Let me start with something simple. Something so ordinary you've probably never stopped to question it. You have a birth certificate. Your parents have one. Your grandparents most likely. And, for most of us, that document feels as natural as breathing. Proof that you exist. Proof that you matter. Proof that the world acknowledges you were born. We carry it to the DMV, to the passport office, to the Social Security Administration. We treat it like a birthright. But here's the thing. For the vast majority of human history, thousands of years of civilization, empire, conquest, trade, and governance, nobody needed one. Not a single soul. And then within the span of roughly 2 decades, at the turn of the 20th century, nearly every industrialized nation on Earth decided that they did. All of them simultaneously, as if following instructions they didn't fully understand. That's where I had to start asking questions. Let's go back not to some primitive, chaotic world, but to a world that functioned remarkably well in many respects without status-ute identity. Documents for individual citizens. Ancient Rome catalogued its citizens, but that was census data, household data, property data. The household mattered. The family unit mattered. Not the individual body, not the individual breath, not the specific moment of emergence into the world as a time-stamped numbered event. Medieval Europe relied on parish records, church records kept by clergy tracking baptisms, marriages, deaths. But these weren't government instruments. They were ecclesiastical ones. The church knew you existed. The state largely trusted the church's accounting. And, critically, you didn't carry them. You weren't required to produce them to function in society. This raises a simple but critical question. If enormous civilizations, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the British Empire at its height, could manage millions of people without issuing each one a numbered identity document at birth, what changed? What exactly did the state suddenly need to know that it hadn't needed to know before? The deeper I went into this question, the more the standard answers started to feel incomplete. We told it was about public health, tracking infant mortality, understanding disease patterns, improving maternal care, and yes, those things happened. Those things are real, but they don't explain the scope of what was built. They don't explain the infrastructure that followed. They don't explain why a document created ostensibly for health statistics became the foundational credential of legal personhood in the modern world. That's where the official explanation begins to collapse. In the United States, the federal push for standardized birth registration began in earnest around 1902, when the Census Bureau established a birth registration area, a voluntary system where states that could demonstrate a 90% registration rate would be recognized as compliant. By 1915, 10 states in the District of Columbia were in the area. By 1933's, just 31 years later, every single state in the Union had joined. 31 years for the entire country to restructure how it accounted for every human being born within its borders. Now, consider what else was happening in those 31 years. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913. The federal income tax that raised through the 16th Amendment, also 1913. Social Security would arrive in 1935, requiring of course a verifiable record of birth. The draft registration of World War I, 1917 required documentation of age and citizenship, and somewhere in the middle of all of this, the birth certificate quietly became the master key, the root document, the thing from which all other legal identity would grow. Not coincidence, not accident, not the natural evolution of a caring society. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. And here's the strangest part. It wasn't just America. Britain's General Register Office, established in 1837, began mandatory civil registration of births, but it took until the early 20th century for enforcement mechanisms to give those records real legal teeth. France, Germany, Australia, Canada, all of them moving within the same compressed historical window toward the same system. Different nations, different governments, different languages, but the same architecture, as if they were all reading from the same blueprint. Here is where I need to introduce a concept that most people find either fascinating or deeply unsettling depending on their disposition. In legal theory, there is a distinction, a critical foundational distinction, between a person and a human being. Now, those words sound like synonyms. In ordinary language they are. But in the architecture of law they are not the same thing. A human being is a biological fact. You are born, you breathe, you exist. That's not a legal determination. That's simply what happens. A person in the legal sense is an entity recognized by the state as having rights, responsibilities, and, crucially, obligations. Corporations are legal persons. Municipalities are legal persons. The word comes from the Latin persona, the mask worn by actors in Roman theater, the face presented to the public, the role played within the system, and what the birth certificate appears to do. But what the deeper I looked, the more it seemed designed to do is create that legal person. At the moment of registration, a record is generated, an entry in a ledger, a numbered document, and that document doesn't just describe you. In the eyes of the state, it may in some functional sense constitute you, at least the version of you the government is authorized to interact with. This raises a simple but critical question. Before 1902, before the registration systems, before the numbered certificates, what was the relationship between the individual and the state? And was it different in a meaningful way? Let me walk you through what a birth certificate actually makes possible. Not what we told it makes possible. A sense of identity, a connection to heritage, a record of our origins. No, what it structurally enables. It enables taxation, not just in the crude sense of the government knows you exist, but in the precise administered sense of assigning you a taxpayer identification. In the United States, the Social Security number required issued at birth, now practically from the hospital flows directly from birth registration. That number is how the Internal Revenue Service knows to come looking for you. Not for your father's household, not for your family's property, for you, the individual unit. It enables conscription. And when the American government needed to draft millions of men into the First World War and then again into the Second, it needed verifiable records of age. Birth certificates made that possible at scale. You could not previously have managed that kind of mass mobilization, with parish records scattered across private church archives in a dozen languages. It enables benefit administration, Social Security, Medicare, welfare systems, public education enrollment. Every single one of these systems is built on the foundation of the birth certificate as the initiating document. Before you can receive anything from the state, you must first be legible to the state, and legibility begins at birth registration. It enables tracking not in some lurid surveillance state sense, necessarily, though that question is worth sitting with, but in the simple, administrative sense. Where you are, who you are, what name you carry, what status you hold. Marriage records link to birth records. Death records close the loop. Property records in many jurisdictions tie back to identity. Documents that trace their route to birth registration. And that's where it becomes impossible to ignore. The birth certificate isn't a record of a life. It appears to be the opening entry in a ledger that will follow that life from its first breath to its last. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. There's one more thread I can't leave hanging, because once you understand that the birth certificate creates a legal entity, a persona, a mask, the state interacts with, a darker question surfaces, one that legal researchers have argued about in obscure journals for decades, mostly ignored, occasionally mocked. What if the document doesn't just represent you to the state? What if it securitize you? Here's what I mean. When governments issue bonds, when they borrow against future productivity, future tax revenue, future economic output, they need collateral, something real, something that will, with reasonable certainty, generate value over time. And in the early 20th century, precisely when birth registration systems were being universalized, governments were also expanding their capacity to borrow massively, backed by the projected economic productivity of their populations. The deeper I went into this, the more one question kept surfacing. Is the registered citizen, the legal person, the numbered entity functioning in some structural sense as that collateral? Not the human being, not the breathing, living person, but the legal fiction attached to them at birth. I can't prove that. I want to be clear. The evidence suggests the question is worth asking. Not that the answer is settled, but consider the pattern. Registration, numbering, bonding, taxation, debt, all of it building decade by decade into an interlocking system where the state's financial architecture and its citizen registration architecture evolved in near-perfect parallel, not separately, not independently, together. And here's the strangest part. When you try to find where that parallel is formally acknowledged in policy documents, in legislative records, in the public discourse of the era, the silence was deafening. Here's what troubles me most, and I want you to sit with this, because it's subtle. When systems this large are built, there is usually a visible transition period, a time when the old way and the new way coexist, when people debate the merits, when newspapers run editorials, when philosophers and lawyers and citizens argue about what it means to register a human life with the government as though it were a deed of property or a corporate filing. I went looking for that debate. I went looking for the philosophical reckoning, the public conversation about what it meant to hand the state the authority to record your child's existence as a numbered entry in a government ledger. The silence was deafening. Not silence in the sense that nobody wrote about birth registration. There were public health advocates and statisticians and census officials who wrote extensively about the practical benefits, but the deeper philosophical question, the one about what it means to convert a living human being into a state-recognized legal entity, that question appears largely to have gone unasked in the mainstream discourse of the era. Why? Not why it was ignored by the public necessarily, but why did the architects of these systems not feel the need to justify this aspect of what they were building? Why did the framing stay so relentlessly practical? Infant mortality, disease tracking, demographic Data when the infrastructure being constructed was so much larger than any of those justifications required. The evidence suggests something much larger was being assembled, something for which the public health rationale was at minimum only a partial explanation. I keep coming back to the coordination problem because this is, in my view, the most intellectually difficult aspect of what we're looking at. Not the existence of birth certificates, not the legal theory of personhood, not even the expansion of the state's administrative reach into individual lives. All of those things have partial explanations. All of those things can be attributed, with some effort, to the natural development of industrial society and modern governance. But the simultaneity, that's the thing. Nation after nation, different histories, different legal traditions, different languages, different governments, some monarchies, some republics, some in the middle of revolutionary upheaval, all arriving at essentially the same administrative architecture within the same compressed historical window. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, and the architecture isn't just similar in broad strokes. The logic of it is identical. The individual as the unit of administration, the birth event as the initiating moment, the document as the legal anchor of identity, the number as the administrative handle. These aren't ideas that different societies would naturally invent independently and arrive at simultaneously. These are ideas that spread, that were shared through what channels, under whose guidance, driven by whose vision of how a modern society should account for its human beings. Those questions don't have clean answers, and I'm not going to pretend they do, but I'll tell you what the official explanation doesn't account for. The official explanation: public health, infant mortality. The progressive era's faith in data and science doesn't account for why the same solution appeared everywhere at once. It doesn't account for the speed. It doesn't account for the subsequent expansion of the system far beyond any public health justification. And it doesn't account for the absence of any serious sustained pushback against what was in retrospect a profound restructuring of the relationship between the individual and the state. Before I close, I want to ask a different kind of question, not about what was built, but about what was replaced in the world before registration, before the numbered document, before the legal person, before the administrative ledger. How